Unlike my golden spoiled brother and parents, my important 14th birthday was ruined. At 20 years old, looking back at that time in my life when I was just 14 is like reliving a strange, surreal dream. I can still feel the frustration, the simmering anger, and the isolation that came with being an older brother to a kid who seemed to have the world, or at least our family, wrapped around his little finger. My brother, who was around 6 years younger than me, had always been treated with the kind of extra softness that parents reserve for a child they consider vulnerable. When he was diagnosed with high-functioning autism at the age of 4, my parents responded by coddling him in every way possible, determined to shield him from the world. While their intentions may have been rooted in love, the effect was far from balanced. It became a matter of him getting whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. To the outside world, my brother seemed like any other kid. Smart, funny at times, and occasionally difficult, but nothing that hinted at the iron grip he had on our household. Inside our home, though, he wielded his special status like a weapon, sometimes consciously, other times just as a natural extension of the privileges he'd come to expect. His diagnosis became a free pass for my parents to let him live by his own rules, often at my expense. If I had something, whether it was a new toy, a book, or even a slice of pizza, he had to have it too. This demand for duplication extended to nearly everything. I quickly learned that I wasn't allowed to have things that were exclusively mine. I remember one particularly painful birthday when I was 11, I was consumed with excitement over the possibility of getting a Nintendo 3DS. For months, I had begged my parents, dropping every hint I could think of, hoping that they would come through. By the time my 12th birthday rolled around, I was nearly bursting with anticipation, and sure enough, they gifted me a shiny new 3DS. Holding it felt like a victory, one of the few times I had something that felt truly mine, but my triumph was short-lived. Within days, my parents started asking me to share it with my brother whenever he wanted to play. Share quickly became code for hand it over on demand, regardless of what I was doing or how much I cared about the game I was playing. It wasn't just the occasional time that he wanted to try it out. It became a regular demand, an expectation that I would part with my gift whenever he decided he wanted. My parents didn't see any harm in it, dismissing my complaints as childish selfishness. And when I tried to assert my right to my own birthday present, they were quick to take the 3DS from me altogether, promising to give it back once I learned to be more generous with my brother. One day, during a family gathering, my aunt witnessed this forced exchange. She saw my parents take the console from my hands after I'd refused to lend it to my brother for the umpteenth time, and she didn't hold back. She gave my parents an earful, calling out the blatant favoritism that had started to permeate everything in our family dynamic. For once, I felt a sense of relief that someone else could see what I was dealing with, that someone understood how one-sided it was. Under her stern gaze, my parents reluctantly returned my 3DS, but not without adding their own twist to the narrative. They blamed me for making a scene. They acted as if I'd been the one to cause the disruption. But after that incident, they stopped demanding that I hand my 3DS over to my brother, at least for a little while. I even caught my aunt casting them side glances now and then, a silent reminder that she was watching. But of course, my parents soon found a workaround. A few days later, they surprised my brother with his very own 3DS. I should have felt happy for him, relieved even. But it was hard to escape the bitterness. It wasn't just about the console. It was the principle. My parents could have stood by their initial decision to make him wait or share, but instead, they reinforced the idea that my brother's desires came before mine every single time. And he took that message to heart, growing even more entitled and smug. On birthdays, mine, friends, even classmates, my brother expected the spotlight to shift to him as well. He would throw tantrums when he wasn't the one blowing out the candles or unwrapping presents. Once, at a friend's birthday party, he made such a commotion about the gifts that he was the center of attention for the wrong reasons. And soon, we were asked to leave. It wasn't an isolated incident either. Over time, it became clear to other parents that having my brother at a birthday party meant the event would inevitably become about him. Invitations dried up, and he was no longer welcome at parties. My birthdays, however, were perhaps the most painful reminders of this warped family dynamic. They were the only days in the year that were supposed to be mine. But somehow, my brother managed to overshadow even those. My 13th birthday stands out vividly in my mind as one of the worst. My parents spent the entire time tending to him, responding to his every whim and frown. And at the highlight moment of the celebration, when it was finally time to blow out the candles on my cake, my brother decided that he wanted to do it. In his mind, it made perfect sense. He was used to getting whatever he wanted, and this was no different. I was stunned when my parents actually considered it. They turned to me with pleading eyes and asked if I'd let my brother blow out my candles, all because he was pouting and about to throw a fit. They didn't seem to see anything wrong with the request. In fact, They acted as if it was the most reasonable solution to the problem. I, however, was determined. This was my birthday, my moment, and I wasn't going to give it up. I refused. And for the first time, I saw them genuinely annoyed with me, calling me selfish and a spoiled brat. They couldn't see that, in this single instance, I just wanted to hold on to something that was rightfully mine. Thankfully, my aunt was there, watching the entire situation unfold. She stepped in, once again chastising my parents for their favoritism, and pointing out that they were letting my brother's diagnosis dictate everything. Her intervention silenced them, but it didn't calm my brother. He threw a full-blown tantrum, screaming and crying because he wasn't getting his way. And in a final act of defiance, he tried to spit on my cake out of sheer spite. My aunt intercepted him just in time, physically blocking him before he could ruin it. She gave him a scolding that finally drove him into my mother's arms, where he dissolved into tears. The next year, as my birthday approached, I thought maybe, just maybe, things would be different. I hoped my parents had learned from the previous year, that they'd realized how much it meant to me to have at least one day a year that was actually about me. I could almost picture it in my head. A normal party, a small gathering with friends, cake, maybe a few gifts. Nothing extravagant, just enough to make me feel like I mattered too. But a couple of weeks before my birthday, my parents sat me down in the kitchen, their faces a mix of what looked like forced sympathy and determination. That look alone sent warning signals through me. I braced myself, not sure what to expect, but knowing it couldn't be good. "Look," my dad started, glancing at my mom, as if hoping she'd pick up from there. She did, giving me a little smile that was meant to be comforting, but only filled me with dread. "We're going to get you some nice gifts," she said, in a tone that seemed rehearsed. "And we'll have a small cake for you. But we're not going to do a full birthday party this year." She said it quickly, as if hoping that the words would land lightly, as if they could somehow slip by without hurting as much as they did. I stared at them, feeling the air in my lungs turn to lead. "Why?" I managed to ask, my voice barely above a whisper. My mom sighed, exchanging another glance with my dad, and then gave me the explanation I dreaded. They wanted to avoid another meltdown from my brother. They didn't say it outright, but it was painfully obvious that they were canceling my birthday for him. They made it sound so reasonable, so logical, as if avoiding his tantrum was the only way to keep the peace, as if sacrificing my happiness was the small price that needed to be paid for family harmony. I felt a hot flush of anger rising up inside me. "I can't believe you're doing this," I said, feeling my hands tremble as I clenched them into fists. But my protest seemed to bounce right off of them. They just shrugged, offering a few platitudes about how it's better this way, and left me sitting there, stunned and angry. For days afterward, I couldn't shake the hollow feeling of betrayal. I felt like an afterthought in my own family, like my happiness was a distant second to my brother's every whim. I knew that I couldn't just bottle this up, so I started talking about it with people I trusted at school. My friends were horrified. They couldn't believe that my parents would cancel my birthday just to keep my brother from acting out. The more I talked, the more the word spread. I even ended up talking to my teachers, who listened sympathetically, and finally, to the school counselor. I felt a little guilty airing my family's problems like this, but I needed someone to understand, someone to acknowledge that this wasn't normal. By the end of the week, the story had spread through the school. Even the vice principal heard about it and pulled me aside one day, offering words of comfort that felt both kind and surreal. I remember him saying, "Everyone deserves a day to feel special. I'm sorry you're going through this." His words meant more to me than I could say, and knowing that there were people who thought this was wrong validated all the anger and hurt that had been building up inside me. But it wasn't long before the story made its way back to my parents, thanks to social media. Friends' parents started sharing my story, expressing their own horror and disbelief at what I was going through. And instead of apologizing, my parents doubled down on their stance. They were furious that I'd told people about the canceled party, furious that their decision was being questioned. They decided to ground me, claiming that I was making them look bad and accusing me of overreacting. It was as though they couldn't see that their actions had hurt. They were only concerned with how they appeared to the outside world. They also started to gaslight me, twisting the narrative and insisting that I was blowing things out of proportion. They acted as if canceling my birthday was a normal, reasonable thing, and made it seem as if I was in the wrong for feeling hurt, but I refused to back down. I told them that being grounded wouldn't change how unfair it all felt, and it wouldn't make me stop talking about it. In fact, I was even more determined to tell the truth, to make sure people understood why I was so upset. I continued to talk to friends at school, explaining that I'd been grounded simply for being upset about my birthday being canceled. Word spread, and soon enough, some of the parents in my school community were contacting my parents directly. I later heard that some of them sent Facebook messages. Others made phone calls, each one expressing their own disbelief. "What the hell is wrong with you?" one of them apparently said. according to my aunt who'd gotten wind of it. It was a small but satisfying victory, knowing that other adults were seeing through my parents' facade. A few days later, the grounding was suddenly lifted. There was no apology, no explanation. My dad simply walked into my room, arms crossed, his expression as neutral as he could make it. "Your grounding is over," he said stiffly, and then turned on his heel, leaving before I could even respond. I sat there, watching him go, feeling a confusing mixture of relief and disappointment. It was almost as if lifting the grounding was just their way of saving face, a reluctant concession to the pressure they were facing from other parents. After that, things went quiet. My parents didn't bring up my birthday again, and neither did I. As far as I knew, the party was still canceled. My brother seemed to relish this fact, taking every opportunity to remind me that I wasn't going to have a birthday celebration. "No party for you," he'd say, laughing at my frustration. It felt like he saw this as a victory, a triumph over my desire to have a day that wasn't about him. But then, 2 weeks later, something unexpected happened. My parents called me downstairs one evening, their faces carefully neutral. I followed them outside, and there, waiting for me, were a few of my closest friends. My parents had organized a surprise party at my favorite restaurant, a cozy little place with a small arcade. I was so shocked that for a moment, I just stood there, unable to process what was happening. As I looked around at my friends, at the decorations, and at the gifts stacked on a table, I couldn't shake the feeling that this party was a desperate attempt by my parents to patch up the damage they'd done. It was like they were trying to prove something, not to me, but to everyone who'd voiced their disapproval. I knew this wasn't a genuine change of heart. It was a last-minute scramble to salvage their reputation. But in that moment, surrounded by my friends and finally getting to celebrate my birthday, I decided to just let myself enjoy it. The dinner was fantastic. My friends and I laughed, ate to our heart's content, and played games in the arcade. It was a rare night of carefree joy, a taste of the childhood freedom that felt so often stolen from me by my family's dynamics. And then came the gifts. My parents had gotten me a PlayStation 4, the gaming system I'd been dreaming about for ages. I was stunned, realizing just how much this surprise party and all the presents must have cost them. Later, my aunt told me that my dad had looked like he'd just seen a ghost as he handed over the gaming console, almost as if the act of buying it had physically pained him. She even joked that he looked like a moth had flown out of his wallet, an image that made me laugh later, but also made the whole event feel that much more surreal. The extravagant last-minute purchases, the hasty party planning, it all felt like a frantic, transparent attempt to make everyone, especially me, forget the fact that they'd canceled my birthday to begin with. The night of my surprise party, things quickly started to unravel as soon as my brother noticed the attention wasn't focused on him. At first, he sulked quietly at the edge of the gathering, shooting dark looks at me every time one of my friends handed me a gift, or cheered as I took my turn in the arcade. It was clear that he couldn't handle the fact that the spotlight was somewhere else. Even for just one night, I knew the sign. I'd seen him work up to a tantrum enough times to recognize the beginnings of it. And sure enough, as the party continued, he started making more noise, edging closer to my cake and the gifts, trying to draw everyone's focus. He began whining loudly, complaining to anyone within earshot about how unfair it was that I got a party. He tried grabbing a couple of the gift bags, but my friend's parents gently nudged him away, redirecting his attention. But it wasn't enough to stop him. As we gathered around the table to cut the cake, he made a beeline for it, a look of anger flashing across his face. I could see his hands reaching forward, inching toward the side of the cake, as if ready to shove it right off the table. For the first time, my parents didn't turn a blind eye or offer him comfort. Perhaps because we had so many guests there, my friends and their parents, my mom and dad finally put their feet down, unwilling to let him ruin the party. My dad stepped in, firmly placing his hand on my brother's shoulder to hold him back. When he whined and kicked, my dad scolded him, something I hadn't seen him do in years. My brother threw a fit right there, screaming and crying, but instead of caving as they usually did, my parents made the decision to give him a timeout, something he hadn't experienced since he was a toddler. My mom took him to the side, standing guard over him to make sure he wouldn't run back to the table or cause any other chaos. Every so often, he would make a break for it, bolting toward the cake or the stack of presents. My friends and their parents watched in awkward silence, unsure how to react. It was strange, almost surreal, to see my parents handling my brother with firmness rather than the usual permissiveness, but I couldn't let myself feel relieved. The whole scene cast a tense shadow over the celebration, and I worried that any minute they might cave and let him have his way, just to avoid the embarrassment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, my mom decided to remove him from the party entirely. She took him by the hand and led him out, marching him toward the car as he continued to scream and stomp his feet. They left the restaurant and drove to a nearby McDonald's, where he could let off steam in the play area. Later, I'd hear from my aunt that he spent nearly an hour sulking inside one of those playground tube structures, refusing to come out until he had to use the bathroom. And as soon as he came out, he tried to run right back in, my mom barely managing to keep him under control. After they left, the atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Everyone visibly relaxed, the tension melting away as my friends and I continued the party without the constant disruption. For the first time, I felt like I could truly enjoy myself without the weight of my brother's outbursts hanging over me. I laughed, played games, and soaked in the rare feeling of freedom and celebration that wasn't marred by family drama. My dad stayed, watching us with a quiet, somewhat strained expression, but I could tell he was relieved too. The absence of my brother's tantrums allowed him to relax, if only for a moment. The night ended on a high note, and for a brief, fleeting moment, it felt like things might change. I hoped that maybe, just maybe, my parents had finally seen the toll their indulgence had taken on me and on everyone around them. But deep down, I wasn't holding my breath. Over the next 4 years, my birthdays became a shadow of that night. My parents never tried to cancel my birthday again, which I guess was something. But it was clear that they were making as little effort as possible. Each year, they took me to a local pizza parlor, a much more subdued affair compared to that single night at my favorite restaurant with friends. I never got another gift as extravagant as the PlayStation 4, and the cake was always a generic one, simple and unadorned. In fact, my name was never written on a birthday cake again, something that gnawed at me quietly each year. It may sound petty to some, but the lack of my name on the cake felt like a small, painful reminder of my brother's influence over our family. Each year, I waited, hoping they'd remember, hoping they'd show even a little thought. But each year, the cake arrived plain, the usual decorations and inscriptions conspicuously missing. My aunt, who remained my staunch advocate, noticed this too. She confronted my parents each time, asking them why they hadn't bothered to write my name on the cake, and each time, they brushed it off, claiming they'd simply forgotten. I didn't buy their excuses, though. I knew the real reason. My brother's picky eating habits extended to an absurd degree, and he refused to eat pieces of cake that had writing on them if it wasn't his name. For some reason, he found it upsetting to see someone else's name on a cake, especially mine. And in their endless quest to keep him happy, my parents had evidently decided that it was easier to forego the tradition of having my name written on the cake than to deal with his fussing. My aunt saw through this too, and each year she found small ways to make the day feel special, despite the lack of effort from my parents. She would slip me a gift on the side, something thoughtful and personal, or quietly hand me an envelope with a little extra spending money, whispering that I should get myself something nice. She knew how much it meant to me, and her thoughtfulness became a cherished part of my birthdays. Those small gestures reminded me that I wasn't completely forgotten, that someone saw me for who I was and valued me as an individual. The rest of my birthdays under my parents' roof followed the same pattern: the pizza parlor, the plain cake, and a handful of friends if I was lucky. And while my brother never again caused as much chaos as he had at that surprise party, his presence always loomed over the celebration. Each year, as we sat around the table, he'd find something to complain about or throw a fit over, and every time, my mom would quietly take him aside, ushering him out to avoid a scene. Looking back, I don't think I'll ever truly understand why my parents allowed things to go as far as they did. Perhaps they felt they were doing right by my brother, protecting him from the challenges of a world they feared wouldn't understand him. Or maybe they simply found it easier to give in than to confront the reality of their choices. But whatever the reason, the legacy of those years has stayed with me, a mixture of love for my family and frustration at the way I was often treated as secondary. As I prepared to leave home at 18, I felt a strange mix of emotion. Part of me was relieved, eager to step out of the shadows and find my own way. And yet, there was a lingering sadness for the family we might have been, for the connection that was lost to years of imbalance and favoritism. On my 18th birthday, I didn't expect much. True to form, my parents organized a low-key gathering at the same pizza parlor, a predictable affair with a plain cake and the same old routines. My aunt, however, had other plans. As soon as the party was over, she pulled me aside, smiling as she handed me a small wrapped box. Inside was a delicate silver keychain engraved with my initials and a simple message: "Be who you are." It was a small gift, but to me, it represented so much more. A reminder that I was worth celebrating, that I didn't need anyone's permission to claim my own space in the world. As I left home with that keychain tucked safely in my pocket, I promised myself that I would no longer let anyone else determine my worth. I'd learned from years of missed birthdays and overlooked moments that the only way to be truly happy was to honor myself, to celebrate my life without waiting for others to validate it. When I moved out, my brother's behavior continued to spiral. Without me there as a buffer, my parents finally had to face the reality of the child they'd raised. His 14th birthday, in particular, was a disaster, as he flew into a rage over not receiving a PlayStation 5. In his anger, he grabbed a chair and began smashing anything within reach, leaving a trail of destruction and tears in his wake. I heard later that my parents were at their breaking point, so mentally and emotionally drained that they confided in my aunt, wishing they could send him to a military or boarding school, but they knew it was far beyond their financial means. In the years that followed, each of my birthdays while still living at home became a predictable cycle. The day would arrive, and like clockwork, my brother would throw his usual fit, demanding attention, complaining about the cake, or trying to grab my presents. Each time, my mom would pull him aside, taking him out of the restaurant or pizza parlor to calm him down, as though it were part of some strange family tradition. It was exhausting, yet at the same time it had a small silver lining. For one day a year, they made an effort, however minimal, to focus on me. They couldn't put his name on my cake without it looking ridiculous, so even though it was plain, the cake still felt like mine, untouched by the compromises I'd grown so used to. During those last few years at home, I clung to small victories. My PS4, for example, became a symbol of my independence. I was still required to let my brother play with it whenever he wanted, but deep down, I knew it was mine. That sense of ownership, even in something as small as a gaming console, became incredibly important to me. So when I moved out at 18, I took my PS4 with me. I didn't ask permission. I just packed it up with my things. It was my own, and taking it felt like taking a piece of my identity, a token of all the years I'd had to fight for a little bit of space that was solely mine. The fallout from that decision was, of course, dramatic. My brother had a meltdown when he discovered it was gone, as though I had taken away some vital piece of his life, rather than a console he rarely touched. His reaction was so intense that my parents, in their usual pattern, caved and bought him his own PS4. The irony of that moment wasn't lost on me. I could only laugh quietly to myself, thinking of how easily they'd given in yet again. But this time, it didn't bother me as much. I was out, free to live my life without the constant weight of my brother's demands overshadowing everything. Without me there, my parents finally had to confront the consequences of years of indulgence and coddling. At first, I think they genuinely believed they could handle him, that they could manage his expectations and temper tantrums. But the reality hit hard and fast. Without me to act as a buffer, my brother's behavior escalated. He was no longer just an overindulged kid. He was a young teen, becoming more aggressive, more entitled, and frankly, more uncontrollable. On his 14th birthday, everything came to a head. My parents had, for once, refused his demand for the latest gaming console, a PS5. I wasn't there to witness it, but my aunt, who kept in close touch with me, told me all about it. My brother went on a rampage, far beyond the usual tantrums. He picked up a chair and swung it around, smashing it into the walls, the furniture, anything within reach. The living room, once a place of calm, turned into a scene of chaos as he unleashed his fury on everything in sight. By the time he was done, the damage was severe. Hundreds, possibly even thousands of dollars in broken items, holes in walls, and shattered glass. My parents stood there, stunned and helpless, watching the result of years of bending over backward to give him everything he wanted. They looked, as my aunt described, mentally checked out. It was as if, in that moment, they finally understood the enormity of the problem they had created. Afterward, they called my aunt, confessing their regrets and frustration. They admitted, perhaps for the first time, that they felt overwhelmed, defeated. They even mentioned, in a moment of desperation, that they wished they could send him to a military or boarding school, somewhere that might instill in him the discipline they could no longer enforce. But they also knew that such options were beyond their financial reach. They had exhausted so much time, energy, and money trying to keep him content that any possibility of a drastic solution was out of the question. I'd be lying if I said I didn't find some ironic humor in the situation. Part of me felt vindicated, a strange sense of satisfaction that they were finally reaping what they had sown. For years, they had ignored my needs, dismissed my frustrations, and indulged my brother at every turn. Now, they were left with the consequences, faced with the reality of raising a child who had never been told no, and who believed he was entitled to everything, even if it meant destroying the world around him when he didn't get his way. But that satisfaction was bittersweet, tempered by a lingering sadness. This wasn't the family I had wished for, and it wasn't the outcome I'd ever truly wanted. Part of me felt for my parents, trapped in the mess they'd made, too late to change what had already been set in motion. And my brother, for all his entitlement and rage, was still just a product of years of misguidance, a child who had never been taught limits, who had no idea how to navigate a world that wouldn't cater to his every whim. As the years went on, I found myself growing, moving forward. I built a life that was mine, surrounded by people who saw me for who I was, who valued my presence without any conditions or favoritism. My birthdays became something I looked forward to, Celebrations that were simple but meaningful, filled with friends who cared about me genuinely. I realized that I didn't need lavish gifts or elaborate parties. What mattered was the feeling of being seen, being appreciated for who I was, without having to fight for space or validation. And yet, there are times when I think back on those early years, the long shadow my brother's needs cast over everything in our home. I wonder how things might have been different if my parents had made different choices, if they had balanced their love for us both, recognizing that each of us had needs, dreams, and feelings that deserved to be respected. My relationship with my parents remains polite but distant. We talk on holidays and exchange the occasional call, but there's an unspoken understanding that we're no longer the family we once were. They're living with the consequences of their choices, facing the challenges of raising my brother without the help they'd once leaned on so heavily. My aunt, ever the steady presence in my life, keeps me updated, sharing small details here and there. But I rarely feel the urge to return home. My life is my own now, unburdened by the ghosts of my past. Sometimes I visit my aunt, and we talk about those years, about the struggles and the small victories. She reminds me, with a warm smile, of the strength it took to come out of it all with a sense of self, to grow into someone who values independence, resilience, and the power to shape my own happiness. I'll always be grateful to her for that, for seeing me when no one else did, for reminding me that I was worth celebrating, even when my own family couldn't see it.